My name is not Jerry Ward. My name is Steve Spencer, but welcome to I Object because I object anyway, just on principle. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks to Jerry Ward, who's off taking care of some legal business today. Thanks for the invitation to sit in for. My name is Steve Spencer. I'm a parental rights advocate, among other things. My life has led me to advocate for parents in different circumstances. Today, we're going to talk we're certainly going to talk about the
big and had
race that's coming up, but we're going to talk today a little bit about grandparent visitation lawsuits and how they pervasively invade families throughout the United States. Not just this show originates in Texas, and God bless Texas, but believe it or not, there are all 50 states in these United States have grandparent visitation access lawsuits. We're going to talk about some of these issues today. Certainly would welcome your call. You can feel free to give a call into the show. Those of you who are listening on the internet who just want to listen, we'd welcome your comments, and we'll keep track of all of those as the show progresses. Let's just give a little bit of context, background. Parental rights are, as recognized by the United States Supreme Court, the oldest fundamental right recognized under our Constitution. It is among the first rights recognized as a fundamental right under our Constitution. What does that mean? That means you, mom or dad, have the right to raise your children without the undue interference of the government. What does it mean to raise your children? To direct the education, the upbringing, and the associations of that child, and to be in control of the care and custody of that child as he or she is being raised. Here's what we have in the legal context to which I object. I object to lawsuits that are thrust upon families for no other reason than a grandparent's selfish desires. Now, we saw some of these types of things by non-parents when the state of Texas invaded a compound of the fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints out in El Dorado, Texas. And by the way, I want to applaud our host, Jerry Ward, for stepping in and defending some of those families in that chaos. We since know what the outcome has been. The outcome has been that the Texas Supreme Court upheld a lower court's ruling that overturned the trial judge's decision to allow the state to retain control and custody of those children and to continue to invade the private realm of the family. But just imagine this. Just imagine that you're a single parent. How are you single? Well, your spouse has left the family for whatever reason. Or what if that spouse has died? You find yourself a single parent, alone, raising children, and grandparents, the parents of your spouse or in the event of death, or a former spouse in the event of divorce or incarceration, those types of things. And the grandparents come in and say, hey, we want our half of the baby. We want a weekend a month. We want 2 weeks in the summer. We want every other spring break. Now, on the surface, you might say, well, that's reasonable. What's wrong with grandparents seeing their grandchildren? Nothing. But when a grandparent is allowed to circumvent a parent and undermine a parent and run to a court and say, I want my half of the baby, give me my half of the baby, that's right, I object. So we're going to talk about that today. These kinds of cases absolutely are pervasive throughout our United States. There have been, all 50 states have had grandparent visitation statutes on their books, in their family codes, in their family law texts for the past 30 years. And here's what really was a watershed moment on this issue. In June of 2000, there was a case out of Washington State that the United States Supreme Court ruled on, and the case is called Troxel versus Granville. Let me tell you a little bit about that case. The mother, Tommy Granville, was married to two little girls' father. That father committed suicide. The father's parents then sued for their half of the baby. They wanted their time with the kids. They wanted it dictated by the court. They wanted it laid out in writing. And it didn't matter if the kids had a soccer game, a softball game, a school activity, a church activity. Didn't matter. They wanted what they wanted, and they wanted it their way, and they wanted a court to give it to them. Well, the state of Washington had a statute at the time that said anybody, anywhere, at any time, for any reason, can seek visitation rights with a child. Ultimately, that case was found that statute was found to be facially unconstitutional. It was found to be unconstitutional on its face by the United States Supreme Court. And that mother was set free from her chains of litigation. But there are families all across this country that today, in June of 2008, remain trapped in cases where grandparents insist on litigating against them for no other good reason, in so many of these cases, for no other good reason than they want their half of the baby. So I object. And I'm going to object repeatedly throughout this program. This issue, ladies and gentlemen, is sure to bring a lot of emotional thoughts to mind. It certainly does with me. I love my grandparents. I wanted my children to have a relationship with all of their grandparents, and it just hasn't worked out that way. And there are families who have had to make, parents who have had to make the difficult choices to say, you know what, this relationship simply is not going to work for my son or daughter or my children any longer. The grandparents simply are not a positive influence on these children, and I'm not going to be able to allow them to see them. Let's put that into another context, though. Let's digress just for a moment and talk about, let's alleviate what some of the emotional thoughts may be right now. You may be saying to yourself, but there are so many people. I'm a grandparent. You may be saying to yourself, I'm a grandparent, and I'm having to raise my grandchildren. And I don't ever want there to be any doubt that I applaud what you do. I honor what you do, and I am fully aware that there are far too many grandparents in our country who are forced by necessity because their own children are drug addicted or incarcerated or absent or simply indifferent to the needs of their children, that grandparents have to step in and raise grandchildren. And in many states, in many states, in most states, in fact, grandparents don't even have the benefit of what state foster parents have in the form of a subsidy from the state to help raise those children. And yet they meet the responsibility anyway. I want to be very clear about this. I honor those efforts. I recognize them, I admire them, and I appreciate them. And I see their necessity in our society today. I'm not talking about those kinds of cases. I'm not talking about a case where a grandparent is forced to make the difficult decision to say, I have to intervene legally and assume custody of my grandchild or grandchildren. I am talking about cases where a grandparent says, I simply want my visitation schedule. I want it laid out in writing. I want it mandated by a court. I want it thrust upon the parents of the child, and I really don't care who it hurts. They are cases that involve almost always a conflict between a parent and a grandparent determined to get their way, a parent forced to make a tough decision in the interests of their children as they understand them. Let me stop there for just a minute. That doesn't mean that I agree with every parental decision that is made on earth. Okay, I may not agree with everything that's gone on in El Dorado, Texas at the FLDS compound. I may not agree personally with the religious convictions or principles to which the FLDS seems to ascribe. But that doesn't mean that I have to be empowered to thrust my opinion onto those families to say, you must think the way I think, you must believe the way I believe, and if you can't do that, we must destroy you completely. We must invade your family. In fact, I think this country is at war with a bunch of people right now that are determined to see us removed from the earth because we don't necessarily believe as they believe, agree with the way they think, do as they do, and I think that's very telling. So we have people who are determined to get their way, parents who are determined to raise their children and make the decisions that they deem to be in their children's best interests as they understand them. And far too often, courts who are sympathetic to grandparents just by default. I think we could all probably understand why they're sympathetic by default, although I object. And we see years of litigation thrust upon families who can't afford it, who don't need it, who are busy trying to raise families, who could otherwise spend those resources that are spent on attorneys, preparing for their children's college education, for their raising, for their future, for their family in general. I've seen families wiped out. I know families who are wiped out. My family has been through that ringer. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that parental rights are far too often disregarded as not being a fundamental right, as not being an element of constitutional liberty in this country. And I've seen judge after judge after judge after judge, and sadly enough, legislature after legislature, determined to impose a state-sanctioned ideal on families just because they believe generally that grandparents are good for grandchildren. I can agree with that. Generally, grandparents are good for grandchildren. Who wouldn't agree with that? But I would point this out to you. Do you know what lousy parents grow up to be usually? That's right, lousy grandparents. You got it. And so while that isn't the case in all of the litigation that we see, we sometimes see a very happy child-parent relationship as children, and then it's fractured somehow when the child becomes an adult. And then the grandparent becomes more and more aggressive, or for whatever reason, things just take a bad turn. It doesn't change the fact that if you choose to homeschool your child, and I know that there's plenty of homeschool families out there listening right now, and I choose to send my children to a public school, which one of us is right? I'm sorry, which one of us is right? You're correct. We're both right. You know why? Because we're making the decisions that we deem are appropriate for our children. And that doesn't make you right, doesn't make me wrong, doesn't make us vice versa. It just makes us parents who are making difficult decisions every day, and the last thing we need is to have lawsuits thrust upon us. Let me give you some examples. Got a call from a lady a few weeks ago near an Army base. Let me just say that. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. Near an Army base in the United States. She found my number. She called me. Said, Mr. Spencer, I'm really at a quandary. I'm being sued by my husband's parents. Well, why? Well, they want grandparent visitation rights. Well, are you and your husband separated? No. Are you divorced? No. Have you ever been? No. Where's your husband? He was killed in action in Iraq. We had his funeral 3 weeks ago. 3 days later, his family sued me for grandparent visitation rights. His parents sued me wanting grandparent visitation rights. I've seen instances where a husband has literally been convicted of attempted murder of his wife. The husband is put in jail, and in Texas, for example, being incarcerated allows, if one of the parents is incarcerated, it allows a grandparent to sweep in and pursue grandparent visitation litigation suits. And so it's far too often a perpetuation of the harassment that keeps a family bogged down in a vicious cycle of abuse and torment and financial ruin, and it is devastating to families. So do you agree? Do you disagree? Where are you on this issue? I'd love to hear from you. I dare you to call in. I double dare you to call in. Jerry told me that, by the way, when I sat in on her show, that I could talk about anything I wanted. And then we had the Democrats shake up their whole primary process and finish it out. We are going to talk about that in the upcoming segments. We're going to have a lot of fun with that. I want you to get ready to comment on those issues. But let me tell you where we are on this grandparent visitation issue, just for example, in Texas. Now, a quick bit of background. Almost all 50 states have now had a ruling, either from an appellate court or a state Supreme Court, as to the constitutionality of their statute. Several states have ruled their statute to be facially unconstitutional. Interestingly enough, some other states have ruled their statutes to be unconstitutional as applied, meaning that the statute as applied to the particular facts of the case the court ruled on was unconstitutional. Some states have held their statute to be facially constitutional. Texas is the only state. Now, let me give you some states that have held their statute to be unconstitutional: Alaska, California, Florida, Michigan, Alabama. So there are several, and there's more than that, more than what I just named. But Texas is the only state that I know of that has held their statute to be both facially constitutional and to be unconstitutional as applied to a particular fact pattern in a case. So Texas is in a real legislative quandary about that. But across the United States, we're seeing parental rights coming more and more to the forefront. We're seeing legislative efforts to reform parental rights. We're seeing efforts to unseat judges who are notorious for abusing parental rights. And we're going to talk about some of that. We're going to wrap the show up with that, with some of these issues here at the end of the show, and talk about judges, legislatures, lawyers, parents, grandparents. We're going to run the gamut of those. We're going to do it in a very quick way. But I want you to get ready, because in our next session, we're going to talk about the presidential election race, how it's shaping up. Democrat versus Republican, McCain versus Obama. Where does Hillary fit into everything? What's going to happen with Romney, Huckabee? We're going to run through the players in the field. We're also going to talk about some things that may be a little touchy for people to hear about, but it wouldn't be somebody didn't object. So if you object, we'd love to hear from you. We're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about the influence of gender. We're going to talk about the conservative versus liberal viewpoints. We're going to talk about how some of the politics have already been played out and what we might expect to see in the coming months leading up to the November general election. So we're going to have an interesting time with that, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, my name is Steve Spencer. You're listening to I Object here on righttalkradio.com. We're coming up on a break, and as we get into that, I want to wrap up with just a couple of observations about what's going on in El Dorado, Texas. In El Dorado, we know that the Texas Child Protective Services hardly functioned as a child protective service. In fact, there was no greater abuser of children in that equation than the state of Texas and its Child Protective Services. So here's what we saw. We saw an overreaching state invade a family's private realm. And you could look at it as one family. You could look at it as an apartment complex. You could look at it as a bunch of families in a subdivision. However you look at it, here's what we already know. The state has said, you overreached. But what did those families have to spend? What did they have to go through? What did they have to endure? What did those children have to encounter? Just to go through that process only to finally, ultimately, hopefully, finally, maybe one day, be reunited with their parents. These are the same kind of issues we're talking about when we talk about parental rights in the context of familial litigation with grandparents and non-parents. And I hope you'll give those great thought. It's worth your time. It's worth your consideration. It's certainly worth knowing whether or not you object. And so I'd certainly love to hear about that. Steve Spencer hosting in for Jerry Ward. The show is I Object right here on righttalkradio.com. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay tuned. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes.